but I know from our conversations, you both share a sense that the state of the world has problems and impending risks that are serious, that are not automatically resolving themselves, that are novel in history. So we can just say the challenging state of the world. What in the nature of human mind, in the nature of human conditioning experience, we might even find that the term psychology or cognitive drivers are insufficient, which is fine, has brought us here, and what might a different relationship to human mind, psychology, cognition look like that might allow a more viable, better future. So just briefly on the meta-crisis frame, before World War II, there was no risk that we could very quickly destroy the entire habitability of human civilization. That was brought into being with very powerful technology, nuclear weapons, and for the first time ever, we had the ability to make a series of bad decisions and radically change the possibility space of the world. Before the Industrial Revolution, we didn't really have the capability of destroying the biosphere at scale. That's not as fast, that takes a few hundred years, but we're at the place where the planetary boundaries in terms of species extinction, in terms of chemical pollution, in terms of many planetary boundaries are being crossed. The Stockholm Resilience Center published its update to the planetary boundaries framework just a few days ago that showed of the 9 major boundaries they've identified, we've radically crossed 6 already, which means who knows if we were to change the direction already what would happen. And that was the result of the Industrial Revolution and the technology that it made possible, moving us from 500 million people before the Industrial Revolution to 8 billion people, and increasing the resource consumption per capita by about 100x in the industrialized world. So 16 times the population, 100 times the resource consumption per population. Obviously, without advanced tech, we couldn't do that. So there's something about the crises that we're facing, and then obviously AI and synthetic biology and drones and cyber weapons and the radically complicated 6-continent supply chain that is all a very novel human technological development that wasn't true in any previous age.
I am Dr. Jill Bolte-Taylor. I'm a neuroanatomist and the author of My Stroke of Insight and Whole Brain Living. I'm a neuroanatomist. I study the anatomy of the brain. So I can visualize in my brain the circuits of how all the information comes in order for me to be able to have a perception of reality. When we look at the human brain, it has emotional tissue in the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere, and it has thinking tissue in both the right hemisphere and in the left hemisphere. So we end up with these 4 very specific groups of cells, modules of cells, that result in very specific skill sets, resulting in very specific personalities that we all exhibit. So we have left thinking, that is structured and organized, and it's what we call our rational thinking brain. It categorizes and organizes. It has language, the ability to create sound, and then another group of cells places meaning on top of that. I know when I'm being analytical and I'm being structured and organized and I'm planning things for the future, or I'm counting 1 + 1 = 2, I know that that's my left thinking portion of my brain. The left emotional part of our brain has miraculously stepped out of the present moment consciousness and given us the ability to remember things from our past or to project ideas into the future. Now, with that, I can create an individuation as well as the linearity across time. And now, because I have linearity across time, I can learn from my past experiences. The right emotional part of my brain is then, how does it feel to be in my body in the present moment? What does it feel like when I dive into the water and I feel the pressure push against my body? What does it feel like to feel water as wet? I'm not on the clock. I'm lost in the flow. I've got this excitement and I have a level of curiosity. And then my right thinking tissue is simply the consciousness of me, big as the universe, connected to all that is, and this immense sense of gratitude that I exist at all. Oh my gosh, I'm alive. We are living creatures made up of these magnificent cells, and there's an awe and a wonder and this deep sense of gratitude. Once you start realizing the 4 different characters inside of yourself and being able to recognize those in others, you can't not see it anymore. And once you understand it, it's like, I have so much more power over what's going on inside of my brain than anybody ever taught me. Wow. And it's beautiful.
We now have very compelling cross-cultural evidence that human beings actually have 2 quite different but equally important types of spiritual engagement or types of spiritual awareness. Now, it's not at all obvious at first, but the failure to grasp both of these ends up being literally catastrophic, affecting everything from education to politics to global warming to world terrorism, as we'll see. But one of these is often called spiritual intelligence. And the spiritual intelligence is one of perhaps a dozen multiple intelligences that all human beings have. Others include ones such as cognitive intelligence, emotional intelligence, moral intelligence, kinesthetic intelligence, musical intelligence, aesthetic intelligence, and yes, spiritual intelligence. Spiritual intelligence is just that, our intelligent or intellectual approach to spirit or an ultimate reality. How we think about that reality, the concepts and symbols we use to represent it, the ideas we form about it, our general worldview when it comes to religious or spiritual realities. When it comes to spirit, it's our talk. The other type of engagement is not spiritual intelligence, but direct spiritual experience. Our spiritual intelligence might tell us that, as one example, we are each intimately interwoven and interconnected with everything and event in the entire cosmos, that we are one with the all. And to support this, we might bring in various spiritual texts, but also various other knowledge branches, such as modern physics, quantum mechanics, systems theory and complexity theory, evolutionary ideas, and so on. These are all ideas held in the mind as we conceive or think about spirit. But the other type of engagement is not spiritual intelligence, but direct spiritual experience. This is not our talk, but our walk. It is not any content of awareness, but awareness itself. Where spiritual intelligence might tell us that we are one with the all, with spiritual experience, we directly and fully experience that oneness with the all. We don't think it, we are it. So-called cosmic consciousness or ultimate non-dual unity consciousness or the great perfection or Christ consciousness or Yeshe or Ansoth, and so on. These are two very different paths. A person can have an incredibly elaborate theory or map or idea or intellectual understanding of the interwoven universe, bringing in all sorts of leading-edge science discoveries, from modern physics to ecology, but still experience themselves as a skin-encapsulated ego existing on this side of one's face and looking at a set-apart, separate world out there. They may think the subject and object are one, unified, interwoven, or non-dual system, but they still experience themselves as an isolated subject in here, looking at a world of separate objects out there. In these cases, spiritual intelligence is high. Spiritual experience is quite low. On the other hand, a person can have a direct satori or awakening experience or enlightenment awareness or non-dual realization, and yet really don't have any extensive ideas of why or how or what that experience is. Their spiritual experience is profound, but their spiritual intelligence is pretty mediocre. And often the ideas they use to explain what they experienced are embarrassingly archaic, out of date, even childish and superstitious. These two engagements are so different that spiritual intelligence is referred to as belonging to the overall path of growing up. Because, like all multiple intelligences, spiritual intelligence goes through a series of stages of development or growing up, becoming more and more complex, more whole, more unified, more sophisticated, and more mature. I'll go over the actual stages of this development in just one moment. But that's the path of growing up. While direct spiritual experience or awareness is known as the path of waking up, a series of direct and immediate experiences that don't necessarily undergo growth, although they can, but that essentially are simply direct and immediate experiences that present themselves in their fullness from the very start. And although there are various forms of this, they often involved a direct experience of the union of an individual self with all of existence and its divine ground. So we have both waking up and growing up, spiritual intelligence and spiritual experience, our spiritual talk and our spiritual walk.
Give some from that can help with growing up and some that can help with waking up. And then I'll very, very briefly talk about cleaning up, because it's a really important area that most people need a lot of work on. And I'll go ahead and start with cleaning up. Cleaning up is also an area that really was only discovered about 100 years ago. So it's still much too recent to be included in any of the world's great spiritual systems. So it's just another area of integral that we have to add to any sort of practice of waking up in order to cover all the bases, because we keep learning things on a daily basis. Cleaning up has to do with what's generally called shadow material, or just unconscious repressed material. And of course, we often associate that particular practice with the name Sigmund Freud. And Freud's inner circle when he started included Carl Jung and Alfred Adler and Otto Rank. And it really was a fairly major sort of discovery on the part of humans. And Freud only wrote his first book in 1895. So again, it's only about 100 years ago that this happened. But one of the things that we found out is that people can actually take aspects of their own awareness, their own mind, their own psyche, and they can judge them harshly and shove them out of awareness. And when you do that, they become unconscious. They become part of your shadow material. And very, very few people escape childhood without some sort of significant shadow material. And we find this in world leaders. We find it, people will often take up a spiritual practice because they have shadow material that's just driving them in really insane ways. And one of the most common things that happens, one of the most common defense mechanisms, is you have some element of you that for whatever reason you really don't like. And it could be because your parents didn't like it, or your peers didn't like it, or you just decided that you thought that was a horrible thing to have. And so instead of working on it, you just denied it, you just disowned it. So let's say you're really over controlling, and that's just a trait that you have. And you sort of shove that out, and that really hyper controlling aspect of you becomes a part of your shadow. And then one of the most common things people do with shadow elements is they project them onto other people. So you're sitting there and you know that somebody is feeling really controlling right now, but it's not you. So it must be your boss. So you project that controlling element of yourself onto your boss. Now your boss might already be fairly controlling, but now he's got two control elements. He's got his and he's got yours. So now he appears like this massively controlling, like he's looking over your shoulder all the time. You start getting reactive. Maybe you snap back at him, and you're sort of headed along a path where you're very likely going to get fired if you keep something like that up. People do this all the time. If they have a particular drive that they want to really complete a particular task, like a man is out raking the yard or something like that, and he's really getting tired of it. And so he's starting to lose track of his own desire to get this done. And his wife sticks her head out the door and says, finish those leaves. And he explodes at her because he thinks she's now just pushing him. She's the one that's forcing him to clean the leaves up, and he just explodes at her and yells. Or you can have a sexual impulse. The ones that Freud examined, sex and aggression. So you can have a sexual impulse with somebody, push that out, and then think they're trying to hit on you all the time. You can push anger out of your awareness, think the entire world is mad at you. You'll often then get clinically depressed if something like that happens. So all of these are, you're getting these symptoms that seem real and just caused by themselves, but they're really caused by your shadow material. And one of the most difficult things as people learn about shadow material is it does tend to mean that those things that you really react to in the environment, that you really hate, really can't stand, those are in many, many cases, at least in some degree, at your own shadow elements. It means you have to admit that, no, wait, you're that person that has all that anger, or you're that person that has all that pride, or you're the person that's over controlling. And it's a very humbling, in some ways quite difficult practice to do. But it also is the source of most of the kind of interpersonal problems that you're having. And so if you were to go to a therapist or something like that, you would end up working on something like that. So one of the things that you can do to help with this whole process that we call cleaning up or reintegrating your shadow elements is simply looking for the people or the things that really, really move you hugely. And it can be, by the way, in a positive or negative way. People can and often do project their positive qualities. And then they end up making heroes out of people, or just admiring them all off the wall. And they just, oh, you're so great, you're wonderful. And they just lost track of a little bit of their own greatness, their own specialness. People do that all the time and end up projecting that onto other people. So they take a first person impulse or quality, they shove it out of awareness into a second person, a you or they or them. And then if that's not enough, they'll shove it all the way into a third person. Oh, it just belongs to him or her, all of them. They're all angry at me for, I don't know why. And so the cleaning up process is reversing that. Let's say you have a dream and you're projecting your anger and it's showing up in the dream as a monster who's trying to eat you. And you're having this recurring dream and you wake up, it's a nightmare, and you wake up almost every night with this horrible dream. So if that's some of your real shadow material, then you want to just reverse the steps that created it. And since it was created by going from first person to second person into third person, now it's just showing up as a monster in your dreams. Then reversing that means take it from a third person, make it a second person, and then make that first person. So in this case, and you often just use what Gestalt therapy calls an empty chair. So you just sit down and you have an empty chair in front of you and you put the monster in that chair. So you're taking that third person monster and you're making them a second person sitting right in the chair across from you. And you start talking to it. Why are you here? Why are you doing this? And you ask it a question and then you play the monster and answer. And then you go back, ask it another question, then play the monster and answer. And after doing that, until you actually start to feel like, okay, I'm the monster answering, then you make it first person. You actually identify with that monster. One of the things you'll find out as you ask, what are you doing, monster? Why are you here? What are you doing? The monster will say things like, I want to eat you, I want to rip you up, I hate your guts, I'm angry at you. So it's got this enormous amount of anger and aggression. It's aimed at you. And that's why you don't feel aggression. You just feel fear, because that's what the shadow is leading you. And so as you've been going back and you've been identifying with that monster, you start to get in touch with that anger that you weren't allowing yourself to get in touch with. So you're re-owning it, you're taking it back. And then when you finally make it first person, you've re-owned it. And if that was the cause of the monster showing up, the monster will stop showing up in your dream. And the same if you projected some of your greatness or your ability onto somebody else and you put them in the empty chair, start talking back and forth, start identifying with them, and then re-own that quality, then you'll get in touch again with that part of you that's very, very special and that you've just lost track of and projected. That turns out to be a really enormous part of people's lives. They project either positives or negatives onto others. And it's particularly common, of course, in relationships. And many relationships that don't have access to some sort of actual practice of cleaning up or some sort of therapeutic practice, those relationships work only if the shadow elements of both people match up well. So if one person projects their controlling nature onto their partner, and then the partner projects their greatness onto their partner, then they'll just go back, oh, you're wonderful, oh, you do it, therefore do whatever I say. So the person will do whatever they say, then, oh, you're so wonderful. Oh, and they just fit, and they just love it. And they never have to confront their shadows, and things go just wonderfully from that time on. But this has been a new addition to human knowledge. Again, only about 100 years old. That was really
One day, in the early morning, Gautam Buddha was sitting in a garden quietly with his disciples. A man arrived silently and stood in the shadows. That man was a great devotee of Lord Rama. He had built many temples across the country. He had devoted many years in the service of Lord Rama. He would always chant Rama's name and contemplate on Rama's greatness. He was old and close to his last years. Even after many years of dedicated spiritual efforts, he was not realized. He wanted to know for sure if there is God or not. When he heard about Buddha, he came to get his doubt cleared. When he felt nobody would notice him talking to Buddha, he asked Gautama, "O Tathagat, please tell me the truth and truth only. Is there God or not?" Buddha, from his intuition, knew that the man to be a great devotee of Lord Rama. He looked at the man with seriousness and said, "No, my friend, there is no God." The man was shocked. Whole of his life he had been believing God, but now Buddha said there is no God. Buddha's words were final for him. With many questions in his mind, he went away from there. When it was getting late in the evening, and once again Buddha was sitting with his disciples in a garden, there came a man who was a materialist, who had been an atheist all his life. He had convinced thousands of people that there is no God at all. He used to go to the priests and scholars and defeat them in the argument about God. He too was getting old, and little suspicion arose in his mind. He thought, what if there is God? Is not it waste of my life to spread the no God message if there is God? He was eaten by his doubt. He finally decided to know the truth and sought the enlightened one. He slowly came up to where Buddha was sitting and asked him, "They say that you are enlightened. Please tell me if there is God or not." Buddha knew that the man is atheist, and he said with firm voice and firm conviction, "Yes, my friend, there is God." The man was also shocked. He had been an atheist all his life, but now Buddha had answered against his assumption. He had faith in Buddha. With many questions in his mind, he also went away from there. One of Buddha's disciples, who was sitting near Buddha in morning and evening, had listened to both the answers of Buddha. He was extremely confused after listening to both these answers. At night, when all were preparing to sleep, he went near Buddha and said, "O Lord, I am feeling very restless due to one question in my mind. In morning, you told one person that there is no God, and in evening, you told one person that there is God. Please tell me, what is the truth? Is there God or not? Kindly reply, else I shall not be able to sleep tonight." The Buddha smiled and said, "The answers I gave them were only for them. It has nothing to do with you. But still, if you want to know, then I tell you." The man who came in the morning was a theist. He had been believing in existence of God, but he never tried to find the truth about himself. His spiritual journey had stopped there. Therefore, I told him that there is no God to grow his spiritual quest. Now he will try to find the truth and his journey will start. The another man who came in evening was an atheist. He had been believing blindfold that there is no God. He also never tried to know the truth about his own existence. His spiritual journey had also stopped there. Therefore, to grow his spiritual quest and start his journey, I told him that, yes, there is God. Now he will try to find the truth, and thus his journey will start. I told each of them what they needed for their spiritual quest to grow stronger. The believer needs to find out, while the non-believer needs to find faith. That's the only way to grow. The disciple asked, "But Lord, what about me?" Buddha smiled and said, "Just continue meditating and you will arrive." In our lives, we see that there are two types of people in the world. One are those who believe in God, and other are those who don't. Whether you believe in God or not, it is not important. Important is to know about our real self. Important is that one needs to realize the truth within himself. Ultimately, how far we reach will depend on how badly we want to achieve the goal. Those who has a great quest to know about their real entity will do diligent self-efforts to find the truth, and the truth will be revealed to those who wants it the most. This is Words of Wisdom, Inspirational Stories. Thanks for watching.
This is a video about the most famous problem in game theory. Problems of this sort pop up everywhere, from nations locked in conflict to roommates doing the dishes. Even game shows have been based around this concept. Figuring out the best strategy can mean the difference between life and death, war and peace, flourishing and the destruction of the planet. And in the mechanics of this game, we may find the very source of one of the most unexpected phenomena in nature: cooperation. On the 3rd of September 1949, an American weather monitoring plane collected air samples over Japan. In those samples, they found traces of radioactive material. The Navy quickly collected and tested rainwater samples from their ships and bases all over the world. They also detected small amounts of cerium-141 and yttrium-91. But these isotopes have half-lives of 1 or 2 months, so they must have been produced recently. And the only place they could have come from was a nuclear explosion. But the US hadn't performed any tests that year, so the only possible conclusion was that the Soviet Union had figured out how to make a nuclear bomb. This was the news the Americans had been dreading. Their military supremacy, achieved through the Manhattan Project, was quickly fading.
This makes the problem of Western Europe and the United States far more serious than it was before, and perhaps makes the imminence of war greater.
Some thought their best course of action was to launch an unprovoked nuclear strike against the Soviets while they were still ahead. In the words of Navy Secretary Matthews, to become aggressors for peace. John von Neumann, the founder of game theory, said, "If you say, why not bomb them tomorrow? I say, why not bomb them today? If you say today at 5 o'clock, I say, why not at 1 o'clock? Something needed to be done about nuclear weapons, and fast. But what? In 1950, the RAND Corporation, a US-based think tank, was studying this question. And as part of this research, they turned to game theory. That same year, 2 mathematicians at RAND had invented a new game, one which, unbeknownst to them at the time, closely resembled the US-Soviet conflict. This game is now known as the Prisoner's Dilemma. So let's play a game. A banker with a chest full of gold coins invites you and another player to play against each other. You each get 2 choices. You can cooperate or you can defect. If you both cooperate, you each get 3 coins. If one of you cooperates but the other defects, then the one who defected gets 5 coins and the other gets nothing. And if you both defect, then you each get a coin. The goal of the game is simple: to get as many coins as you can. So, what would you do? Suppose your opponent cooperates, then you could also cooperate and get 3 coins. Or you could defect and get 5 coins instead. So you are better off defecting. But what if your opponent defects instead? Well, you could cooperate and get no coins, or you could defect and at least get 1 coin. So no matter what your opponent does, your best option is always to defect. Now, if your opponent is also rational, they will reach the same conclusion and therefore also defect. As a result, when you both act rationally, you both end up in the suboptimal situation, getting 1 coin each, when you could have gotten 3 instead. In the case of the US and Soviet Union, this led both countries to develop huge nuclear arsenals of tens of thousands of nuclear weapons each, more than enough to destroy each other many times over. But since both countries had nukes, neither could use them. And both countries spent around $10 trillion developing these weapons. Both would have been better off if they had cooperated and agreed not to develop this technology further. But since they both acted in their own best interest, they ended up in a situation where everyone was worse off. The Prisoner's Dilemma is one of the most famous games in game theory. Thousands and thousands of papers have been published on versions of this game. In part, that's because it pops up everywhere. Impalas, living in between African woodlands and savannas, are prone to catching ticks, which can lead to infectious diseases, paralysis, even death. So it's important for impalas to remove ticks, and they do this by grooming. But they can't reach all the spots on their bodies, and therefore they need another impala to groom them. Now, grooming someone else comes at a cost. It costs saliva, electrolytes, time, and attention, all vital resources under the hot African sun, where a predator could strike at any moment. So for the other impala, it would be best not to pay this cost. But then again, it too will need help grooming. So all impalas face a choice. Should they groom each other or not? In other words, should they cooperate or defect? Well, if they only interact once, then the rational solution is always to defect. That other impala is never going to help you, so why bother? But the thing about a lot of problems is that they're not a single prisoner's dilemma. Impalas see each other day after day, and the same situation keeps happening over and over again. So that changes the problem. Because instead of playing the prisoner's dilemma just once, you're now playing it many, many times. And if I defect now, then my opponent will know that I defected, and they can use that against me in the future. So, what is the best strategy in this repeated game? That is what Robert Axelrod, a political scientist, wanted to find out. So in 1980, he decided to hold a computer tournament.
He invited some of the world's leading game theorists from many different subjects to submit computer programs that would play each other.
Axelrod called these programs strategies. Each strategy would face off against every other strategy and against a copy of itself. And each matchup would go for 200 rounds. That's important, and we'll come back to it. Now, Axelrod used points instead of coins, but the payoffs were the same. The goal of the tournament was to win as many points as possible. And in the end, the whole tournament was repeated 5 times over to ensure the success was robust and not just a fluke. Axelrod gave an example of a simple strategy. It would start each game by cooperating and only defect after its opponent had defected twice in a row. In total, Axelrod received 14 strategies, and he added a 15th called random, which just randomly cooperates or defects 50% of the time. All strategies were loaded onto a single computer where they faced off against each other. One of the strategies was called Friedman. It starts off by cooperating, but if its opponent defects just once, it will keep defecting for the remainder of the game. Another strategy was called Joss. It also starts by cooperating, but then it just copies what the other player did on the last move. Then around 10% of the time, Joss gets sneaky and defects. There was also a rather elaborate strategy called Grasscamp. This strategy works the same as Joss, but instead of defecting probabilistically, Grasscamp defects in the 50th round, to try and probe the strategy of its opponent and see if it can take advantage of any weaknesses. The most elaborate strategy was Name Withheld, with 77 lines of code. After all the games were played, the results were tallied up and the leaderboard established.
The crazy thing was that the simplest program ended up winning, a program that came to be called Tit for Tat.
Tit for Tat starts by cooperating, and then it copies exactly what its opponent did in the last move. So it would follow cooperation with cooperation and defection with defection. But only once. If its opponent goes back to cooperating, so does Tit for Tat. When Tit for Tat played against Friedman, both started by cooperating, and they kept cooperating, both ending up with perfect scores for complete cooperation. When Tit for Tat played against Joss, they too started by cooperating, but then on the 6th move, Joss defected. This sparked a series of back and forth defections, a sort of echo effect.
Okay, so now you've got this alternating thing which will remind you of some of the politics of the world today, where we have to do something to you because of what you did to us. And then when this weird program throws in a second unprovoked defection, now it's really bad, because now both programs are going to defect on each other for the rest of the game. And that's also like some of the things that we're seeing in politics today and in international relations.
As a result of these mutual retaliations, both Tit for Tat and Joss did poorly. But because Tit for Tat managed to cooperate with enough other strategies, it still won the tournament. We're being joined.
Hey, my God, there's Professor Axelrod.
Hey, there's Steven Stewart's.
Whoa, what a treat this is.
And I imagined initially it'd be sort of like computer chess, where you need a pretty complicated program to play a sophisticated game. But in fact, it was not like that at all. It was the simplest strategy that did the best. So I analyzed how that happened.
Axelrod found that all the best performing strategies, including Tit for Tat, shared 4 qualities. First, they were all nice, which just means they are not the first to defect. So Tit for Tat is a nice strategy. It can defect, but only in retaliation. The opposite of nice is nasty. That's a strategy that defects first. So Joss is nasty. Out of the 15 strategies in the tournament, 8 were nice and 7 nasty. The top 8 strategies were all nice. And even the worst performing nice strategy still far outscored the best performing nasty one. The second important quality was being forgiving. A forgiving strategy is one that can retaliate, but it doesn't hold a grudge. So Tit for Tat is a forgiving strategy. It retaliates when its opponent defects, but it doesn't let defections from before the last round influence its current decisions. Friedman, on the other hand, is maximally unforgiving.
After the first defection, just from the opponent would defect for the rest of the game. Okay, that's it. No mercy. And that might feel good to do, but it doesn't end up working out well in the long run.
This conclusion, that it pays to be nice and forgiving, came as a shock to the experts. Many had tried to be tricky and create subtle, nasty strategies to beat their opponent and eke out an advantage. But they all failed. Instead, in this tournament, nice guys finished first. Now, Tit for Tat is quite forgiving, but it's possible to be even more forgiving. Axelrod's sample strategy only defects after its opponent defected twice in a row. It was Tit for 2 tats. Now, that might sound overly generous, but when Axelrod ran the numbers, he found that if anyone had submitted the sample strategy, they would have won the tournament.
I mean, it's so clever. There's so many layers to this story. After Axelrod published his analysis of what happened, or circulated it among these game theorists, he said, now that we all know what worked well, let's try again.
So he announced a second tournament where everything would be the same except for one change, the number of rounds per game. See, in the first tournament, each game lasted precisely 200 rounds. And that is important, because if you know when the last round is, then there's no reason to cooperate in that round. So you're better off defecting. Of course, your opponent should reason the same, and so they should also defect in the last round. But if you both anticipate defection in the last round, then there's no reason for you to cooperate in the second to last round, or the round before that, and so on all the way to the very first round.
And so in Axelrod's tournament, it was a very important thing that the players didn't know exactly how long they were going to be playing. They knew on average it would be 200 rounds, but there was a random number generator that prevented them from knowing with certainty.
Yeah, if you're not sure when it ends, then you have to kind of keep cooperating because it might keep going and you might need them on your side. Yeah. For this second tournament, Axelrod received 62 entries and again added random. The contestants had gotten the results and analysis from the first tournament and could use this information to their advantage. This created 2 camps. Some thought that clearly being nice and forgiving were winning qualities, so they submitted nice and forgiving strategies. One even submitted Tit for 2 tats. The second camp anticipated that others would be nice and extra forgiving, and therefore they submitted nasty strategies to try to take advantage of those that were extra forgiving. One such strategy was called Tester. It would defect on the first move to see how its opponent reacted. If it retaliated, Tester would apologize and play Tit for Tat for the remainder of the game. If it didn't retaliate, Tester would defect every other move after that. But again, being nasty didn't pay.
And once again, tit for tat was the most effective.
Nice strategies again did much better. In the top 15, only one was not nice. Similarly, in the bottom 15, only one was not nasty.
After the second tournament, Axelrod identified the other qualities that distinguish the better performing strategies.
The third is being retaliatory, which means if your opponent defects, strike back immediately. Don't be a pushover. Always cooperate is a total pushover, and so it's very easy to take advantage of. Tit for tat, on the other hand, is very hard to take advantage of. The last quality that Axelrod identified is being clear.
Programs that were too opaque, that were too similar to a random program, you couldn't figure them out because they were so complicated. It was very hard to establish any pattern of trust with a program like that because you couldn't figure out what it was doing. Not you. I mean, the other programs it was playing couldn't figure them out. And so they would end up more or less defaulting to thinking, every turn is like the last time I'm going to see you, so I might as well defect. What to me is mind-blowing about this is that these four principles, being nice, forgiving, provocable, and clear, is a lot like the morality that has evolved around the world that is often summarized as an eye for an eye. It's not Christianity, by the way. It's not turn the other cheek philosophy. It's some older philosophy.
What's interesting is that while Tit for Two Tats would have won the first tournament, it only came 24th in the second tournament.
This highlights an important fact. In the repeated prisoner's dilemma, there is no single best strategy. The strategy that performs best always depends on the other strategies it's interacting with.
For example, if you put tit for tat in an environment with only the ultimate bullies of always defect, then tit for tat comes in last.
I wanted to see whether, for example, the tit for tat did well because it did well with really stupid rules that didn't do well at all themselves, that basically it took advantage of people.
So he ran a simulation where successful strategies in one generation would see their numbers grow, and unsuccessful ones would see their numbers drop. In this simulation, the worst performing strategies quickly shrink and go extinct, while the top performing strategies become more common. Harrington, the only nasty strategy in the top 15, first grew quickly, but then as the strategies it was preying on went extinct, Harrington's numbers also quickly dropped.
This shows a main benefit of this simulation because it tests how well a strategy does with other successful strategies.
After 1,000 generations, the proportions are mostly stable, and only nice strategies survive. Again, tit for tat comes out on top, representing 14.5% of the total population.
Now, this process may sound similar to evolution, but there is a subtle difference, which is that in this case there are no mutations, so it's actually an ecological simulation.
But what if the world you started in was different?
Imagine a world that is a really nasty place to live, more or less populated with players that always defect. Except there's a little cluster of tit-for-tat players that live in some kind of nucleus. And they get to play with each other a lot because they're geographically sequestered. They will start building up a lot of points, and also, because that translates into offspring, they'll start to take over the population. So, in fact, Axelrod showed that a little island of cooperation can emerge and spread, and eventually will take over the world, which is fantastic. How can cooperation emerge in a population of players who are self-interested, who are not trying to be good because they're good-hearted? You don't have to be altruistic. You could be looking out for number one for yourself and your own interests, and yet cooperation can still emerge.
Some argue that this could explain how we went from a world full of completely selfish organisms, where every organism only cared about themselves, to one where cooperation emerged and flourished. From impalas grooming each other to fish cleaning sharks. Many life forms experience conflicts similar to the prisoner's dilemma, but because they don't interact just once, both can be better off by cooperating. And this doesn't require trust or conscious thought either, because the strategy could be encoded in DNA. As long as it performs better than the other strategies, it can take over a population.
Axelrod's insights were applied to areas like evolutionary biology and international conflicts. But there was one aspect that his original tournaments didn't cover. What happens if there is a little bit of random error in the game? Some noise in the system. For example, one player tries to cooperate, but it comes across as a defection. Little errors like this happen in the real world all the time.
Like in 1983, the Soviet satellite-based early warning system detected the launch of an intercontinental ballistic missile from the US. But the US hadn't launched anything. The Soviet system had confused sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds with a ballistic missile. Thankfully, Stanislav Petrov, the Soviet officer on duty, dismissed the alarm.
But this example shows the potential costs of a signal error and the importance of studying the effects of noise on those strategies.
The word game sounds like it's a children's game, or, there's something, a misnomer maybe in calling it game theory, because these are life and death matters, obviously. And as you mentioned that this came up in the Cold War, it could actually be life and death of the whole planet. We could annihilate human civilization. So these are not games in any kind of trivial sense. It's just the term that is used by mathematicians and theorists.
When tit-for-tat plays against itself in a noisy environment, both start off by cooperating. But if a single cooperation is perceived as a defection, then the other tit-for-tat retaliates, and it sets off a chain of alternating retaliations. And if another cooperation is perceived as a defection, then the rest of the game is constant mutual defection. Therefore, in the long run, both would only get a third of the points they would get in a perfect environment. Tit-for-tat goes from performing very well to performing poorly.
So how do you solve this? Well, you need a reliable way to break out of these echo effects. And one way to do this is by playing tit for tat, but with around 10% more forgiveness.
So instead of retaliating after every defection, you only retaliate around 9 out of every 10 times. This helps you break out of those echoes while still being retaliatory enough to not be taken advantage of.
And so we also ran the tournament with noise and generosity. And that did quite well. My favorite example is tit for tat does really well, but it could never do better than the player it's playing with.
Think about it. By design, all they can do is lose or draw.
And yet, when the results of all interactions are tallied up, they come out ahead of all other strategies. Similarly, always defect can never lose a game. It can only draw or win. But overall, it performs extremely poorly. This highlights a common misconception, because for many people when they think about winning, they think they need to beat the other person. In games like chess or poker, this is true, since one person's gain is necessarily another person's loss, so these games are zero-sum.
But most of life is not zero-sum. To win, you don't need to get your reward from the other player. Instead, you can get it from the banker. Only in real life, the banker is the world. It is literally everything around you. It is just up to us to find those win-win situations and then work together to unlock those rewards. Cooperation pays, even among rivals.
From 1950 to 1986, the US and Soviet Union had trouble cooperating, and both kept developing nukes. But then, from the late 80s onwards, they started reducing their nuclear stockpiles.
They too had learned how to resolve conflict. Rather than making an agreement to abolish all nuclear arms at once and essentially turning it into a single prisoner's dilemma, they would disarm slowly, a small number of nukes each year, and then they'd check each other to see that they had both cooperated, and then repeat the year after, and the year after that, all along checking to ensure mutual cooperation. In the more than 40 years since Axelrod's tournaments, researchers have continued to study which strategies perform best in a variety of environments. In doing so, they varied everything from payoff structures to strategies to errors and more. Some even allowed the strategies to mutate. While tit for tat or generous tit for tat doesn't always come out on top, Axelrod's main takeaways still hold. Be nice, forgiving, but don't be a pushover.
Can I ask you, why did Anatole Rappaport submit tit for tat?
Well, the reason was because I asked him to. and he wrote saying, yeah, I'm willing to do that, but I just want to be clear that I'm not sure that this is really such a good idea. He was a peace researcher, and I think his own inclinations were to be much more forgiving and maybe and not be so provocable.
What I find fascinating is that one of the main things that sets life apart from non-living things is that life gets to make decisions. We get to make choices that don't only change our future, but also the future of those we interact with.
See, in the short term, it is often the environment that shapes the player, that determines who does well, but in the long run, it is the players that shape the environment. So let's play a game, the game of life. And make your choices wisely, because their impact may reach further than you think. Using the right strategy matters, but figuring out the best strategy isn't easy. It requires critical thinking and innovative solutions, like Axelrod's tournaments. If you're looking for an easy way to build your problem-solving skills, then check out this video's sponsor, Brilliant. Brilliant will help make you a better thinker in everything from math and data science to programming, technology, you name it. You can start right now for free, straight from your device, the device you're watching this on. All you need to do is set your learning goal, and Brilliant will design the perfect path for you, equipping you with all the tools you need to reach it. Did you like today's insights from game theory? Then Brilliant's brand new course, Intro to Probability, is the perfect next step. Introduction to Probability is your gateway to mastering the tools of chance, risk, and prediction. You will learn how to construct and analyze models of real-world situations, from electrons and business decisions all the way to the 2023 Women's World Cup. Whether you're a budding statistician or you just want to learn about randomness and chance, this course will equip you with the skills you need to make decisions in uncertain situations. You'll even take a page out of Axelrod's playbook and learn how to build computer simulations to put your strategies to the test. Beyond probability, Brilliant has a massive library of content covering everything from math to data science and programming to technology. What I love about Brilliant is that each lesson is hands-on, so you'll build real intuition. And the best part is that you can learn with Brilliant on the go. To try everything Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days, visit brilliant.org/Veritasium. And the first 200 of you to sign up will get 20% off Brilliant's annual premium subscription. So I want to thank Brilliant for sponsoring this video, and I want to thank you for watching.